thanks all for having us here. And I'm excited to talk about, I guess it's kind of a relevant topic in the US. In terms of women's lives in general, the timing of pregnancy is something that's important to them, to families. We think about it a lot, and it's one of those things that is actually part of major demographic kind of shifts in the past 40, 50 years. The average age at first birth in the US was 21 years old in 1970. Kind of hard to even imagine now. The average age at first birth is 27. Many women wait until they're in their mid-30s to have children. Part of the reason probably is that children are very costly, it seems, in terms of your career, either opportunities or just in terms of what you want to do when you have children with your career. And event study estimates give us something like 30% earnings losses kind of in the long term after having children. In countries even where there's very high female labor force participation, where there's very high female labor force participation and pretty egalitarian gender norms like Sweden and the Nordic countries. Those estimates are interesting, but it's been hard historically to study causal impacts, maybe precisely because children are so costly for women's careers. They time them endogenously, potentially, to what's going on in their careers. And then there are a few kind of experiments that shift the timing of childbirth, although there are a few which are kind of listed here. So there are some older papers studying the cost of an additional child from twin births, changing the timing of birth due to miscarriages. There are also more recent papers looking at access to abortion to change the whether a child is born or not. And then there's this Lundberg, Plug, and Rasmussen paper, which studies the effect of IVF successes or failures, and we're going to be able to do that in our setting too. So that has been done. I think with all of these papers, you kind of wonder about the counterfactual and if they're identifying the effects that you're interested in. And we're kind of contributing to this set of identification strategies. We're going to be able to study a setting where we know that women wanted to delay having a child because they had some long-term birth control in place that doesn't involve any action on their part in order to work, so IUDs or birth control implants. And they sometimes, very rarely, get pregnant anyway in those situations. And then we're going to show you and try to convince you that we have a good counterfactual for these women, and we can kind of get at the causal impact of an early birth. We're also going to compare that on the other side to something similar to what Lundberg, Plug, and Rasmussen do, which is we're going to be able to study women who all want to have children very much, are having fertility treatments, and sometimes it looks like also pretty randomly those succeed or fail. And we're going to compare the impact of children in those two groups. They're not like counterfactuals for each other. They can't be. One group was definitely not trying to have children. The other group was trying to have children. That happens at different parts of the life cycle and everything. But it looks like the impacts are different and probably not in a way that's explained by the characteristics of the groups, although we're still working on that part. Okay, so what we are going to study again is women who have a contraception failure, and we're going to compare women who get the same kind of birth control at the same age. And just controlling for that, it looks like this looks almost like an experiment, at least with respect to what's going on in their labor market trajectories. This is a nice setting because LARCs work passively. They're going to be called LARCs throughout this whole presentation, long-acting reversible birth control or contraception. So LARCs work passively and failures are really rare. The nice thing about the working passively is that we're not going to have to worry too much like you would for the pill that, if you didn't really care whether you got pregnant or not, maybe you don't take the pill as carefully. And these women are really not wanting to have children because they're getting this costly, somewhat invasive birth control. The other side of planning, as I'm going to call it, is identified from successes of your first, that we observe, in vitro fertilization attempt. And we're also going to, it looks like a pretty random thing, with respect to labor market outcomes, whether that initial procedure succeeds or fails. And about a third of initial attempts are successful. We're going to compare those births that result from a successful initial procedure to, compare it to women who had initial failure. Many of them will go on to get pregnant later through, future IVF procedures. And so to do something like compare planned and unplanned, the effects of planned and unplanned pregnancy, we have to account for the birth timing and the control group, which is very different between the two. So we're going to do that. In particular, what I mean by that is, using some econometrics language for things that are, really important big choices in women's lives. So flag that. But if you think about the setting as a setting where we have a random success or a random failure of birth control, then our compliers are women who have the child after a birth control failure. Some women will have an abortion after a birth control failure, which we also observe, and they may go on to have children later. And in the control group, women may, decide that they want to get pregnant in a few years and have a child at that time. So what I can show you is this intent to treat, what happens if you have a failure. I think that looks like it's pretty causally identified. The thing that is hard to compare to is a different setting, this IVF success or failure, where, again, the control group, the women who have a failed initial IVF procedure will go on to have children too. They might do so at a different time, and really at a very different time compared to these women who have unplanned pregnancies or don't have unplanned pregnancies. Accounting for that differential timing of birth is kind of essential. So like dynamic, you could call it non-compliance with treatment assignment, is essential for making any comparison. So we're gonna try and do that. So I'll show you both this intent to treat, the effects of initial pregnancy on outcomes. We're gonna, So we're gonna do two comparisons, LARC failures and IVF successes. So our instruments, we're gonna just match on the age at which you had the procedure or got the prescription, and the age you are, the year that you got the prescription and the age that you are now. And just controlling for that seems like it really, equalizes labor market outcomes between the treatment and control group in basically all the ways that we can see. There are some small differences for IVF, but they're really very small, and the motherhood penalty is very large, so we're not as worried about it. This will give us the impact of having an unplanned pregnancy or a planned pregnancy relative to not, but relative to your counterfactual self, including the fact that you might have gone on to get pregnant later, and that the impact of that future planned pregnancy might be different than the impact of an unplanned pregnancy, because that's what planning does. It may mitigate the costs.
Isn't it a little surprising, that education wouldn't matter here in some respects, that you could imagine
it is surprising. It's amazing how little it does. So if we additionally match on education, that doesn't change our estimates. Yeah. Yep.
So the reason why we're looking at these two different experiments with these two different populations is because we want to check external validity.
No, the reason that we're looking at the two different experiments is that I think there are two kind of questions that are interesting. One question is, what is the impact of unplanned pregnancy on your life? That's an interesting question. We might want to estimate the impact of unplanned pregnancy. We'll find that it's very costly, that it's associated with earnings losses in the long term that are pretty large, like 30%. Sound familiar? And then another interesting question that we can ask is is it more childbirth seems to be costly. So in general, whenever people have children, that seems to impact their career a lot. Is it worse when you have an unplanned pregnancy, or is it just that children affect your life in a way that we know is true and can see in event studies and things like that?
I guess I was just confused about the question was, if you're comparing people who have kids earlier to people who have kids later in their life.
Yeah.
So that kind of, I thought that was the question.
Yeah.
You see my point? If I were to look at this from this perspective, that these two could be two equally valid experiments, but with two very different populations.
Yeah.
But there's also these other twists you're talking about. One is
Yeah, so we're thinking that we're going to call this estimate the impact of an unplanned birth, and we're going to call another estimate the impact of a planned birth. Like, it's not really planned, like it was planned to be earlier, and then that's why you're having IVF. So it's hard, but the main difference, I think, is that you potentially made a lot of investments ahead of time, or you're in a place in your career where you think it's desirable to have children, and women who have unplanned pregnancies are not. And then we can look at women who, are older versus younger that have unplanned pregnancies, and we'll do that. But it's an impossible experiment. We can't compare the same woman who has a planned and unplanned early birth, because that doesn't happen. So we'll try to kind of look at the age differences and see if that's what's explaining the effect, and it seems like it is for the most part.
I guess another way of phrasing this question is, thinking of delay, you could think of one of the benefits women may have of endogenously delaying pregnancies is they're able to move further up the career ladder.
Yeah, so we look at the age, yeah.
The question is, how do these different quasi-experiments affect women of different ages?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at whether the effects are larger for younger. We'll find that the effects of unplanned pregnancy. Next slide. Okay, I'll talk about this later. So we'll find that unplanned births have a large impact on earnings. That actually I forgot to put this in. Okay, there are small changes in disposable income, but what you really see is that they're kind of don't seem to get promoted, or they don't move up in the occupation ladder. And that's particularly much more true for younger women who have an unplanned birth than older women. What I will tell you that I wish we could do, but we just can't because of the smallness of the data, is and our identification strategy actually is look at women who had LARCs for 10 years, and some had a failure in year 10, and some had a failure in year 1. That would be kind of interesting. Maybe that's random timing, and when it failed, we're not going to be able to do that because we don't have enough women who have we don't have enough data to do that. But we're still seeing women who, maybe for endogenous reasons have the LARC when they're 31 years old, and some who have it when they're 25 years old, and that's what we're identifying off of. We also see that these unplanned births they're associated with large earnings penalties. They're much larger than the estimates for IVF. In fact, we can't say that the IVF estimates, they look like they completely recover. Small gap, but there's almost no long-term penalty relative to the control group, women who also sought to become pregnant but didn't. We see that the unplanned birth penalty, like I said, is larger for younger women, and that all of the occupation not upgrading, I will say, is coming from younger women. And this is in contrast to basically complete recovery among women who were already planning to have children after they have children relative to the control group. And that doesn't differ by age of the woman having the IVF procedure, which is interesting. But we have a lot less age variation there than we do for unplanned pregnancies, because there aren't really any 22-year-olds. The 10th percentile of the IVF treatment woman is 30 years old. So we don't have too many young women, but even among the under 30 in that group, there seems to be the same impact in recovery as for the older women. Yep. Yeah, so I'll show you in a minute. It's smaller than you'd think. It's about 30%. So, I don't know what your priors are, but it doesn't seem like it's not as high as my prior was, I guess.
How does that compare to the abortion rate not associated with LARC?
That's a great question. I'm not too sure. I'm not sure. I can look that up, but.
You'd expect it to be higher, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if a LARC means that you really don't want to have a child, but I think it also is true that on average, the woman getting a lot of abortions happen for younger women, and our women are more older than the median age at which you're having an abortion, which is less than 25. Maybe it's 25 to 28. So I had age bins at one point, and most of our women are on the what side is this? The right side of the age bins, just because of the way our sample is, which is here.
You could calculate how much more likely conditional on age.
Yeah, we could do that. So we should do that. Yeah, I haven't done that yet. My impression is that, having an abortion even when you have an unplanned pregnancy is not super common, but it's I'm not sure if it's 30% or 50%. Yeah.
I guess there are like potential different treatments that sort of group of women who choose to have an abortion, like if they have the birth, like
Yeah.
would you expect their
Oh yeah, so no, this is all of our estimates are for compliers, and that's local, like to the compliers. The abortion, women who select to have an abortion, like it doesn't look like abortion itself has a causal impact. Like we don't see any dips right at the time that they have the child, but they're definitely on a different, it's like different trajectory than women who don't. So
expect these like group of women to like
so I don't know what the,
invest or like less negative or
I don't know. Yeah, that would be a total guess. I don't know. I guess if it's all, I would think that they would have larger effects because it seems like, again, everything is worse with younger ages. And they also are selecting like out of having a child because presumably it's more costly. So I think our study is informative for the impact for women who are like marginal on having a child or not. Like they have the child only because they became pregnant. They wouldn't have chosen to have a child, but when they do, they don't have an abortion. So it's like a group that's very marginal on having a child, and so I think it's a relevant question whether it's like no impact of an unplanned birth on their career. Maybe we would urge women to be less worried about the impacts of unplanned birth or the impacts of children on their career. It doesn't seem like that's the result that we're getting. Yeah. We don't observe the procedures. We observe something that comes before the procedures, which is like a meeting to talk about the abortion. But it seems like we pretty much have the right number or close to the right number of abortions. We might be under a little bit, but we have a measure of abortions.
So you could compare women who decide to have an abortion.
Yeah, they're not the same. So they're selected. And I think I'll show you what they look like in terms of their career paths too. If I'm able to click on the links, we'll see. So what we're going to do is combine Swedish labor market data. This is our data set. It's for historic exogenous reasons, specifically women who are born between 1965 to 1983, which means the youngest woman in our sample is 22. Like we don't have any teenagers in our sample, so we're not studying a group of LARC users that are interesting. This is all women who many of them are done with school. The labor market data includes earnings, disposable income, occupation. We'll use occupation right now just in a category of whether you're in a job that involves medium skills, high skills, education-based, or you're a manager in your occupation. And we can look at some other occupation measures like flexibility in the workplace and things like that. I don't think that's in the slides, but we have occupation codes which we can link to measures of family friendliness as well. But right now we're just looking at this career trajectory, dummy. And then and I'll just note, we have some demographics. One thing that is really interesting that we don't have, but we're kind of trying to look at with Danish data, in Sweden, we do not have cohabitation unless you have a child with a person. So we can't, I don't know, and I can't tell you about whether the effects are different by whether you have a partner, before you have the child, because the control group doesn't register as having a partner. And that's interesting, and you're going to ask about it, and I just can't, I can't say. So we can look at married women, but there are a few, of them that are married. So we link this with the Swedish health data, and that includes, the medical birth registry, which will have the date of birth of the child, some outcomes of the child, the prescription drug register. This is the main thing that we're using actually, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then some inpatient and outpatient procedures. You might think that we're using insertions and removals, like insertions of IUDs or birth control implants. And that would be nice, and that was what we thought we were going to do. But unfortunately, we learned that this is missing primary care doctors, and that is where a lot of these insertions happen. So we just don't see we don't see enough of them, and we definitely can't use that to identify whether you actually had a LARC in place. Instead, we're going to rely on this prescription drug register, which is going to, have every time that somebody paid for a prescription. And I'll talk about that in a second. Again, it would be nice if we could use the procedures, but we don't. We just know that these women intended to get a LARC, to not get pregnant at point T, and we're going to look at pregnancies that occur right around that point. So presumably their intentions didn't change, and they weren't like having it for 2 months and then deciding that they wanted to have children. Well, it's possible. Okay. We are going to, have data on a lot of characteristics, and we see, interestingly, that the sample of LARC users is not too different from the sample of women overall. This is like women chosen at the midpoint in our data. That they're, on a lot of characteristics looking like the average woman in Sweden. So they're not selected to be, particularly older or younger. And their earnings are, a little bit lower, but not too different from women in Sweden in general. I will say that, these are different by contraception type. I won't show you, but the implant users are younger and the IUD users are older, a little bit older. Yep.
Did you lose any in all women, or there was some selection on?
This is like 2008. I think that's the midpoint of our data.
Regardless of age?
Yeah, this is regardless. Yes, it's regardless of age, but our cohort is one that is all pretty much of childbearing age in this period.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a good point. There are no 60 or 70-year-old women in there. Yeah. But good call. Yeah. Yes. So these are all. So now I can't remember actually. I believe now that you say that these are all women without children. Sorry. Yes. So it must be. Good call. Yes. So these are all women who haven't had children yet in 2008 in our sample. The LARC users we're only going to study first births. So the relevant sample is people who haven't had children yet, potentially. I don't know. I mean, if children affect your earnings, then yeah, I would expect the LARC users to.
Even type graph, do you see no childbirth penalties on the second birth or anything like that?
Oh yeah, so you do. They're smaller, much smaller, but yes, you see a little bit. We aren't looking at those women, and actually they're more common IUD users, but they're also seem to be, it's not as good of an experiment. So we don't have cohabitation data. Maybe if we could control for that, we could do a better job, but it seems like they're selected, like having the failure conditional on already having children. You're wealthier and more likely to be married and stuff, and probably more likely to be cohabiting. So they don't look random. We can try and do something about that later, but we just haven't looked at those women right now. So the big penalty and observationally is definitely for first children. It's like, I think it's 3 times higher for first children compared to later children. And for later children, it seems like there is a lot of selection into who gets pregnant while on a LARC. Okay. We are gonna focus on women who, again, have prescriptions and basically take a window around your prescription and see that you conceived relatively recently after getting this LARC prescription. It's not a perfect definition, but you might be comforted to know that in Sweden, unlike the US, and I don't know how it is in Canada, you physically, the way you get these prescriptions is you go take your prescription to the pharmacy, get the actual device in your hand, pay $100 for it, and then take this physical device to the doctor. So we're going to be measuring the time at which they purchased it. So they paid $100 and they now have the physical thing. It's possible that they never, had it inserted or anything like that, but we take out a few people who later get birth control pill prescriptions. But this is kind of the best that we can do. The unplanned pregnancies, again, are going to be women that, our baseline is women that get pregnant within 9 months of filling this prescription. And we vary that 9 months, 6 months, 3 months looks very similar, just smaller samples. The other thing that we do is focus on women without children, as we've discussed. That's where the big penalty happens. That's presumably where the big cost of children comes in, and that's where it looks like we have a counterfactual for these women. When we take the 3-month definition, and then all women, not just the ones that are in our sample, the failure rates that we get are very similar to what you would read about in a packet when you get an IUD, which is 0.5%. So it looks like fairly similar failure rates to what you would expect. But there are lots of potential issues. This isn't actually an experiment. Like, we're not making someone randomly pregnant and not. It's definitely true that failures are going to be more likely when you have more intercourse or when you're more fertile, at baseline. So we can, we match women on age to kind of account for some of this fertility differences, and match them on the fact that they've not had children before. We see no, conditional on just that, we really see no differences in pre-trends and labor market outcomes on average even. No differences in trends and no differences in averages. We do see a small difference in household status, so we can match on, what we do see in terms of whether you're married or divorced or single. We don't know cohabitation. When we match on that, it doesn't affect additionally on that, it doesn't affect our results at all. And our results are robust to adding various labor market controls, household composition, et cetera, in case you were worried that these things were really imbalanced and we were just getting some kind of average luck or something. We also, will note that it's possible women didn't actually use the LARC that they got, and that's potentially, a problem. We'll just define it as they did not intend to become pregnant at the time that they made this costly purchase, and that's what we know. We can take out the women, or I think have taken out the women that seem to have pill prescriptions, after they got a LARC, which, maybe it didn't work and they switched to a less reliable form of birth control. So there are, out of our sample, there aren't so many of them. And the results are, yep.
If you just say, okay, there's some fraction who actually chose not to have it implanted, but apply the average fertility at that age to the population, what fraction of the observed pregnancies that you would see would be, like, more, I don't know, 10% of women actually don't get the single class.
And then they use another, if they don't use any birth control.
What is the population average? I just want
Yeah.
to get an order of magnitude idea.
Yeah, I haven't done that, and I think it would be hard to do because, like, the numbers are, so I think we would have to assume that the number of women that didn't actually get it implanted are small.
Well, yeah, of course, it's going to be conditional on that assumption that we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, I mean,
10% didn't take it. I think that's not unreasonable.
Yeah.
10% back out. But
yeah.
what fraction of the births would be among that?
Yeah, I haven't done that calculation, and I should do it. It could be a lot because we only have really 335. So, yeah. But I think that either way, they're a group that didn't intend to become pregnant as evidenced by their choice, and they don't look different than women who have the LARC working in the pre-period. So these kinds of worries are always present, and mainly the only thing I can do is just show you the pre-trends that aren't there, and then show you the big impact of children on their career once they're born. And then, I'll just note, as asked, women do select into abortion, and that means that our estimates are local to the complier population, and there might be some really big costs that we're not measuring, or maybe some small costs. I just don't know for the non-compliers. Okay, in terms of balance, it's not truly an experiment, but we see that there are pretty similar in terms of most labor market measures. The women who have an unplanned pregnancy versus the ones that don't, there is a big difference in the propensity to be married. And when we control for that, and that makes sense kind of, but when we control for that, it doesn't really affect our overall results, or when we interact with, when we match on civil status, it doesn't affect our results. Women who have abortions do look different than the population. This is the year before the prescription. They look different in the years before that as well, so they're on kind of a different path. But this is just the group that we can't estimate the impact of children for them. Okay, the equation that we're estimating is just matching. So we interact the year that you got a prescription, how old you are, and then study the impact of unplanned pregnancies in the years around that that event, the birth control prescription. And as a reminder, this is a setting where there's like dynamic compliance with treatment. So women in the control group are having children. This is the share of women with any childbirths to date. There are also some women, that have an abortion that later have children by like period 5. And in the control group, 40% of the control group that's matched on age have children by the end of the period, by 7 years after the LARC prescription. Sorry. And I'll note that, this means some of the counterfactual for these women is never having children at all. So, that's a small number, 40%. Okay, so what do you see in terms of just the patterns in the data? This is the intent to treat impact of unplanned pregnancy on income. Their average earnings are like 200 SEK, so this is like a pretty big impact. You would scale that by the fraction of compliers, 1 over the fraction of compliers to get the impact of a child in period 0. This is just the impact of unplanned pregnancy. So it's large and it seems persistent-ish, but also there seems to be some recovery. Again, that's hard to interpret when the control group is having children too. So they're all having, this large impact later, and we have to take that out. Yep.
So if you do the same patient for regular pregnancy, what's this sound?
Well, we don't have a so we can't do that. This is not an event study. This is just plotting your income over time in the treatment group versus the control group. So we only have a control group because, we have an experiment. What we could do, what people have done, what you see is event studies, which are identified off of, this 28-year-old woman who has a child compared to this, 28-year-old woman who has a child when she's 32. The effect is extremely similar, actually. Yeah, so shockingly. So, well, that's your interpretation. One other interpretation might be that the event study estimates are. No, they're not. I think 30% of births are unplanned, so it's not that. They're not unplanned. It's just that the event study is telling you like averages of women who have children at totally different times for endogenous reasons. I took out all the event study graphs because I end up having long discussions about them if they're in there. But there are big pre-trends actually in this group of women, at least in those estimates. So that's telling you that people are probably having children endogenously in relation to their income, or that they're working harder in advance of having children. We don't know, but it all makes it hard to interpret, I think, the event study estimates. Yeah, this is the intent to treat, so you have to, it's bigger, yeah. But when we do, like if we just plugged in what the estimates are from the Sweden LARC users event study, they are, I used to have these graphs, they're right on that. And if we did what you would expect if the treatment and control group have the same impact, so the null hypothesis is the effect is the same as the event study, you get this exact line basically. It's a little bit lower, but it's not much. Where you don't get that is the IVF successes or failures. So, I think that it's kind of hard actually to put all these pieces of evidence together. If you believe the event study estimates, then you would actually conclude that unplanned pregnancy is as costly as, pregnancy in the general population.
What is the Swedish welfare state do about like the earnings of doing like maternity leave or?
Yeah, so this is excluding maternity leave, and we have graphs in the paper which doesn't exist yet, but for disposable income, and I'll just do it with my finger really, or I'll do it with this pointer. This is what disposable income would look like, basically. Very, very. It doesn't fall very much because you get like 80% of your payments in maternity leave. And then, it's not statistically different from zero, still, under the line, but there's a lot of transfers that make the whole thing flat. So it's not just maternity payments. Yeah.
Am I reading this right? Is that you get a hit to income when
No, it's year 2 is the year that you have the baby for a lot of women, because we're defining it as a conception that took place within 9 months of getting the prescription. That's period 0. So people are having the child in month 18. It's really annoying timing, actually. But yeah.
I was wondering if something like,
yeah.
They start going on a path on the assumption.
No. So this is not centered around the birth. This is centered around prescription. Okay. So I won't show all of these things because I'm guessing I won't have time to show all of them, but the estimates are pretty similar when we consider shorter windows, just like noisier. If we started going out to longer windows, then they are not. There's like a lot of imbalance because basically women are selecting to have the children at that time. They're getting the IUDs removed. And then if we use a definition based on pill usage, which is much weaker, like, you might be worried about a lot of things with identifying whether somebody had an unplanned pregnancy based on their pill prescription data. But we can do that. So we can do it 2 ways. One way is like you conceived after you took out a pill prescription after you'd already conceived, probably didn't know you were pregnant. When we do that, we get similar estimates actually in terms of we get similar estimates in terms of the impact of pregnancy. So, and a lot more sample. So, going in the same direction, but a less convincing identification strategy. And then when we include controls, none of these things affect the estimates at all, like at all. I wish I could click on this, but I can't. Okay. Yeah, you'll see just a bunch of lines right on top of each other. When we match additional and civil status, that also doesn't affect our results. So there is some imbalance in that, but it doesn't seem to be driving the labor market differences. Okay, and when we look at IVF successes or failures, we're going to have the same strategy. Basically just did you have the same plan, go for an IVF procedure and at the same age and have it not succeed versus have it succeed. And again, I'll note that there is dynamic, compliance issues with treatment assignment, as in many women who don't have an initial success go for a treatment a month or 2 after, and so they give birth within that same initial year, and then many others give birth just very soon after that. So we have not one as the intercept, because control women sometimes give birth in the same year, and many of the control women have children in period 1 or 2 after the initial IVF treatment. So when you're looking at these big dips and then a little bit of recovery, it's hard to talk about the causal impact. You have to account for the fact that the control group is having those big dips a little bit later, and that'll affect, what the impact is compared to never takers, or to dynamic never takers. Okay, so the effect of IVF success on earnings, it's 0 in our data. So, this is just the intent to treat. Again, we have to scale it. There is some initial imbalance. So, if you look over here, you see that it looks like somewhat, richer women are more likely to have a success. I'll just say that in the Danish paper previously on IVF, they also have a little bit of this. They normalize it to 0. If we did that, we'd get numbers very similar to what they get in terms of the impacts in the long term. So it really doesn't seem like what you see for the event study estimates, right? This is a very different motherhood penalty, and it's not permanent. But I want to compare these 2 situations because, again, I think an interesting question is whether unplanned pregnancy is differentially costly compared to planned birth. Do you have a question, sir?
If you look at other outcomes, like labor force attachment, also learning.
Yeah, so I'll show you as many as I can. We've looked at a million. We can't look at spousal stuff very easily because we just don't have the partner unless the child is born, so we don't have a counterfactual. But, yeah.
Are the coefficients involved fairly similar, or are these?
The initial impact is, I could do it in percentages. The initial impact is, but the long term is 0 in one case and not in another case. Yeah. So what we're going to do next is try to account for the differences in the behavior of the control group in terms of when they have children. You can imagine that a model in which, there are some characteristics that affect your earnings, and one of these characteristics is when you had a child, how recently it was, and whether that child was planned. So that's what we're writing here. Depending on how many years since your child was born, And whether that birth was unplanned or planned, there might be a differential impact on earnings. So everybody has either a planned or unplanned child, first child. This is all first child. And by the way, I'll make the note that the effect of first child includes subsequent children. You know, it's like the summary of what happens when you have a child. And then what we see in the data with these ITT estimates are differences compared to whether you are in the treatment or control group. So initial IVF success, talking about IVF, versus not. That's going to be just the, if we did the algebra, that's the effect of children in period 0, the period 0 effect of children on your earnings, times the difference in the fraction of the treatment and control group who has a planned child in period 0. Okay, and then in period 1, these ITT difference, in period 1 is we have these children who are now 1 year old, and now we have some more children born differentially between the treatment and control group. They're born in period 1, which means they're getting the initial impact row 0 in that period. The nice thing is, this means that the intent to treat estimates are just the sum of the rows times the difference in the fraction of the treatment and control group who had children at a particular time. And we can back out what they are because, this row 0 is identified from this first year 0 difference in means, basically, between the treatment and control group. Once we know that, we plug it in here, and we can identify row 1, et cetera, et cetera. So we can kind of back out the impact of children relative to not having a child at any point in the window on your earnings. The way we estimate this is we're just gonna take these equations into a GMM where we have an instrument of whether you had the unplanned pregnancy or not. Okay, so we have one instrument and many periods, many moments that it's going to speak to, but they're all related to one another in a way that's identified by this recursive formula. This is very similar to what Cellini, Ferreira, and Rothstein do in the context of municipal bond passing or failing. So different context. I don't think it's been applied to, the birth of children before, but the math goes through, and what you need to assume is that the impact of children is the same no matter when the child was born, in your life, controlling for your age. Or whatever goes into X. So for example, if the control group didn't have a child in period 0 and had the child in period 2, that has the same impact. That has the initial impact of the child is the same. The other thing that we need to assume is that this is looking like a good late estimate of the impact of children. So in particular, what you'd be worried about in the IVF setting is that, an IVF failure directly has an impact on, your labor market outcomes. It might be very disappointing and stressful, and that might make you either invest more in trying to have children or less. Either way, it might change your labor market earnings. So I think you can definitely criticize like the IVF experiment on these grounds, and I think we should all keep in mind that this is going to be an exercise that's conditional on this actually being the causal impact of children. In the IUD case, what you'd be most worried about is that women who have abortions like the abortion impacts you. That's a big exogeneity violation, I think, that you could worry about. I can't click on the descriptives, but when we plot, for women who have an abortion, how do their earnings evolve? You don't see like an impact of the abortion, like a drop in their earnings around the time that they have an abortion or anything like that. So it doesn't seem like it's at least an instantaneous impact. I don't know. So I don't know that it does or doesn't. I don't know of any studies that look at that, but I think it's a little bit more credible than the IVF assumptions that you need. Maybe you disagree. So we are going to then do something similar. So we extract these estimates for the IVF success or failure, and we're going to call that the estimates of the rows for the planned rows. We're going to assume that the impact of unplanned birth is also summarized by these equations, but that when the control group has a child, they have a planned child, not an unplanned child. So they're going to get these rows that we estimated like in the first step from the IVF successes or failures. And we haven't, but we will reweight those based on the composition of the women who are having IVF, like looking different on X's. we haven't done that, but we actually don't see much variation on X anyway. So what you get when you do that, I'm rushing a little bit, is this graph of the what the Cellini-Rothstein paper calls treatment untreated. I don't like that term, but it's just the effect of a child compared to not having a child in any of these periods. So not your counterfactual self, just this is the pure effect of having a child. And we do that so that we can compare these estimates without worrying about differential behavior in the control group. And what you see is, the IVF successes or failures, those are the purple ones. They're associated with recovery, basically, compared to the, it's not completely zero, but there's a lot of recovery compared to the unplanned births. And these estimates are noisy because we're doing some recursive taking out of noisy estimates, but it does seem like there's significant differences in like the medium term for unplanned births versus planned births. Okay, now let's look at some other, yep.
You have a lack of spousal information here.
Yeah, we have a lack of spousal information. We're hoping to add that. We do have married, divorced, and single, and so we can control for that, but a lot of Swedes cohabit. A lot of them don't get married ever, and when they do get married, usually it's after they have a child. So, or often it's after they have a child. Okay, this is employment. It's very noisy comparatively. So this is the intent to treat. This is what happens when we compare the IVF, the planned births, with the unplanned births. There don't seem to be big differences on this margin. And then when we look at occupation trajectory, that's where we really see a difference for these unplanned births. There's nothing like this for the IVF successes or failures, and the point estimates, if we scale that, are really large. So women who have an unplanned pregnancy are much less likely than their counterfactual selves to be in high skilled or medium skilled, even some college basically occupations, compared to women who don't have the failure. And that is true when we account for like the timing in the control group. And when we compare to planned births, these are totally different estimates throughout the whole period. And what's interesting is that it seems like this occupation result is driven by younger women. It's not really on the employment margin, it's on the what kind of jobs you have margin. So if we look at the earnings decline by age, now this is in percentage points so we can compare better, you see that we have this really unfortunate, I still don't know what this is, but something happens in period 6 for the older 30 women that it's always going to be in all these pictures. But if you kind of ignore that point, what you see is that there seems to be a smaller impact in general in terms of earnings for women who are older compared to women who are younger. That's this lower line. And when we look at the occupation results, it's totally driven by these younger women, this occupation decline. And if anything, it's flat or not significantly different from 0 for older women. And if you look at so I think if we look at employment, there doesn't seem to be much age heterogeneity, but this is super, super noisy, so I can't reject much. If we look at where you are in the earnings distribution, so the propensity to be above median earner, that's not actually that different by age, if you ignore this weird data point at period 6. What is really different by age is this propensity to be in the top of the income distribution, so above the 90th percentile of earnings. Again, we have really large standard errors for older women, but for younger women, they're much less likely to be in those top positions if they have the unplanned birth compared to if they didn't, compared to also younger women, that didn't. So, I guess a fair way of putting this is that we have really large standard errors for older women, so maybe we can't tell much. But definitely for younger women, it seems like occupation downgrading is, or lack of being promoted or moving up in the earnings distribution is what is happening for them after they have an unplanned birth. And we don't see anything like that for IVF. If I did IVF by age, there would be the same recovery for all the age bins we can think of. They can be much more narrow because actually we have a lot more people in getting IVF procedures than having these IUD failures. We will, in the very near future, reweight so that we can really directly compare on observables the IVF group to the unplanned pregnancy group and see if it's all observables that are explaining these differences. We haven't done that yet. So the labor market income drop is large. It's 30% of earnings overall. We see total recovery for women who use IVF to get pregnant, and we use that to causally identify their impact of children compared to women that also tried IVF but didn't become pregnant. We see that that the negative impacts of these unplanned pregnancies, which are persistent, are driven by women switching to lower skilled occupations, and in particular, younger women. Yep.
Have you looked at differences by education? When you think about going to lower skill occupations, things at the top of the distribution,
Yeah.
it seems like you'd be getting much bigger effects.
Yeah.
Than the lower educated ones.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think one thing that complicates it really is that their education period is very long in Sweden. So many women in their like late 20s and 30s, my co-author tells me, are still, doing some kind of schooling. And so I think that it's hard to tell in period T-1, you might not be done, but you might be done if you have an unplanned pregnancy. So I guess that's one way I'd put it. But we have looked at that, and I can show you after. I don't have any clickability in my slides, but we've done heterogeneity by education, and we don't see much actually. But I think we have a kind of weak measure of your what your actual education potential was, or what your factual path would be, because it's kind of happening at the time that many of them were getting some education, or potentially would get more education. Who knows? But we should do more on the heterogeneity. Like, we can only do really 2 by 2 because we have 350 overall, so it's tough. But we'll do more of that. Our point estimates suggest, again, that it's not really employment that's driving this. They are employed, they're just working in, it seems like, worse jobs, especially when they're younger. I don't have time to show other outcomes. Another thing that we can look at that's interesting, but we don't see any impacts actually on, is measures of mental health. So diagnosis of like depression or anxiety, which I haven't seen much in this motherhood penalty literature. And you can imagine, is affected by having children, especially unplanned children, but we actually don't see that there's, negative effects on mental health by these measures. Yeah. Okay, so the impact of children on births is substantial. Seems like planning mitigates that. If we count the IVF estimates as being women who plan to have children. We also see that the effects for unplanned births are larger for younger women, which suggests that, even if you're not planning it, if you're in a better place in your career or older, it's not as impactful as for younger women. And I think that that this is all, part of this interesting thing that happens around the time that you have children, which is that you make plans, you worry about children, but you have no idea what they're going to do to your career, maybe, until you actually have them. It's a one-time thing that's hard to learn about and hard to, probably very idiosyncratic. So what we're thinking about doing is, or what we're going to be doing in the fall is like, just a survey to understand what women's expectations are around the impact of children on their careers. And we want to compare that in 10 years with what actually happens by linking that to administrative data. So I look forward to telling you about that in 10 years. Okay.